this morning is a reading I have shared with just about every congregation I've been privileged to minister to since I first got it in 1996. Because to me it expresses the essence of Thanksgiving. It goes back to, since it was written in 96, it goes back to a movie and a novel that were current at that time, and a river runs through it. You may have seen the novel. You may have seen the movie or read the novel. It starts with a quote from Wendell Berry. This is by a woman named Susan Hall, who was a UCC minister in Charleston, mentored me through the decision to go to high school. The Wendell Berry quote that begins is, "We are what we are given, and what is taken away." Norman McLean wades into the swift silver of Big Blackfoot River, casting for memories with the same reverence he reserves for trout. Planting his feet in the slowly deepening riverbed, Norman begins to hear the long story of his life cascading by, from his birth in Missoula, Montana, where the riverbanks were the breasts on which he fed as a child, through arrested adolescent initiation in the roaring rapids, the still reflections of his first love, to the dark eddies of gambling and debt that pulled his brother under. Now all are gone home before him in that great race to the sea. Eventually, Norman concludes, from the timeless sibilant prayer of water on rock, eventually all things merge into one, and a river runs through it. There is a river that runs through us. It is mystery. It is life. Some say God. It descends through my granite soul with the force of gravity and love, plunges through empty canyons, chisels out corridors with its wet hands, and slowly, ever so, widens the cracks and crevices of my failures into pools where grace collects. The injury of the river is also its gift. Where I have been cut deeply, so there life most deeply, most surely flows. I don't believe that the gifts of God come in the form of goodness, but in the face of life itself, in danger's shadow as well as dazzling light, in a disquieted heart as often as a still mind, in labor as in love. If we would receive the sacred, we must receive the river's flow, even as it injures, even as it takes away. I thank God for my handicap, said Helen Keller, unable to hear a bubbling stream or see its glistening green or put it into praise. Yet she praises. I thank God for my handicaps, for through them I have found myself, my work, my God. That, to me, is Thanksgiving. It's not about being glad for the good things that have happened to us. They are simply moments of the sun. Thanksgiving is standing still with an injured and an open heart and letting the river run freely through us. Each year at this time I stop and cast into the water. I recount the story of the year past, of life given and taken away, our planet's staggering losses, our moments of forgiveness, our fulgent gains. I think of a friend's child who came swimming into this world on amniotic rivers, and I remember my grandmother's final crossing over to the other shore. I remember the intense hope of eyes brimming with the vows of marriage, and the loosening tears of those whose hope was broken. I think of my own love found, or friends lost. We are what we are given, and what is taken away. Blessed by the name of the giver and taker. The confluence of all things returns to the sea, the source. The gift unites with the giver. Let the river run. The banks of my heart are wide with thanks. A Monomoyick Thanksgiving. I posted this week on Facebook where I was when I found that the president had been shot. I was in 10th grade in prep school. I don't remember who told us, but we were summoned to the chapel. The whole school. I remember the chapel bell tolling, and the chaplain, Bob Croxon, one of my great heroes as a minister, got up and gave an impromptu sermon which had the title, "It is a good thing when a good man dies." I've pondered that ever since in the assassinations that followed and in all of life's vicissitudes. I'm not sure I understand it, but I think I frame this particular subject, this Thanksgiving, with that. How can we be grateful in the face of a great evil? Whether evil is done to us, evil done by us, or evil done by others from whom we benefit, from which we benefit. Now, I'm also feeling a lot about leaving Cape Cod for 6 months on sabbatical. I rejoice that fate has led me to this beautiful place, and I will miss the Cape fiercely. They say absence makes the heart grow fonder. It seems to me every moment I have drinking in, trying to drink in more keenly what it is. But history tells us that we're here. We're enjoying this place. The descendants of Europeans such as myself, we're occupying this land because our ancestors got it from the native inhabitants through germs and guns and guile and a little bit of money. How does that square with our gratitude for living here? Gratitude is an important spiritual practice. I heard a friend say she emails herself every day a list of things she's grateful for. I'm not much on lists, but I do try to drink in every moment, as I just said. Counting your blessings is an ancient way of connecting to the source of human good, whether you consider that source to be natural or supernatural. Gratitude, my friends, is a choice. It is something we can opt to do. It's a counter to despair. It is a cure to depression. And it is always available to us. In any situation, no matter how bad, we can look for the blessing. So we come to celebrate Thanksgiving in a place that was occupied for thousands of years by people called the Monomoyick, a branch of the Wampanoag. Within a quarter mile of the place I live in Chatham is Battlefield Road. That name commemorates the first encounter between Native Americans and Europeans here on the elbow of Cape Cod. The French explorer Samuel de Champlain guided his vessel past Harding's Beach and into Stage Harbor in October of 1606. He noted in his log, quote, "Along this coast we observed smoke, which the Indians were making, and this made us decide to go and visit them. Here there is much cleared land and many little hills, whereon the Indians cultivate corn and other grains on which they live. Here are likewise very fine vines, plenty of nut trees, oaks, cypresses, and a few pines. This would prove a very good site for laying and constructing the foundations of a state, if the harbor were a little deeper and the entrance safer than it is. But it was not to be. The history website for Chatham describes what happened. The Native Americans here, who had been here for at least 10,000 years, paddled out in their canoes and greeted Champlain hospitably. Nevertheless, 2 weeks of increasingly uneasy contact erupted into a fatal skirmish under circumstances that are still unclear. 3 of the Frenchmen were killed and 1 fatally wounded. Many more Monomoyick were killed by French musket shot. After a retaliation that included an unsuccessful attempt to capture slaves, Champlain weighed anchor, giving up any ideas of making Chatham a French foundation of state and leaving the way clear for the English. Unquote. Champlain named the place Malabar, the bar of bad fortune. The same website goes on. It wasn't until 50 years later, in 1656, when the first English settler ran a cart down the ancient Indian pathway with an eye on living here. Englishman William Nickerson struck a deal for 4 square miles of land with the Monomoyick sachem Matakasan, or Matakasan, I understand this proper pronunciation now. For this he paid a shallop, 10 coats, 6 kettles, 12 axes, 12 hoes, 12 knives, 40 shillings in wampum, a hat, and 12 shillings in coins. This transaction took place, however, without the approval of authorities in the Plymouth colony. And so for 16 years, this purchase would be disputed until he settled with the courts by paying a fine of 90 pounds and obtaining written deeds from Matakasan and his son John. Nickerson had to pay those fines, incidentally, to the court in Plymouth because under the doctrine of discovery, all land transactions with the natives had to be conducted by the colony as a whole, not by individuals. So although the Monomoyicks were compensated for their land, the compensation was artificially low because of that same doctrine of discovery that I talked about a couple of years ago. From that time forward, natives and settlers lived side by side in this town. I surmise there was some intermarriage and assimilation. But it is appropriate that we eat cornbread this morning. Here's a quote from that same website. Corn, introduced by the Monomoyick natives centuries before, already grew readily here and soon became the town's principal crop. In fact, the cultivation of corn was so important in Chatham that a law was passed in 1696 which stated that all households were required to kill 12 blackbirds or 3 crows each year, delivering the heads to the selectmen or forfeit a tax of 6 shillings. So these 2 events in Chatham, Champlain's battle, 1606, and Nickerson's arrival 50 years later, bracket the iconic Thanksgiving feast in Plymouth, 1621, which has been taught to American school children for decades as the emblem of the hospitable Indians and the starving colonists. It is the origin myth for our celebration of this American holiday. We now see the truth as considerably more complex. It's not just that they ate deer more than turkey, or there's no mention of cranberries or yams. It is that that feast fits into a different narrative, a long narrative of unspeakable sorrow, whereby the people living on this land died, got displaced, lost their way of life, their religion, their language. The Monomoyick who confronted Champlain apparently tried armed resistance, but they were outgunned. Armed resistance of the settlers was never again tried in this area, to my knowledge. The Native Americans were slow to realize that their way of life was the superior, and did try to displace the settlers by force in King Philip's War in the late 17th century. but the settlers narrowly won. From that time forward, the U.S. government periodically made and broke peace treaties with various tribes, and there was armed resistance by Native Americans and massacres by the U.S. cavalry in retaliation up until the late 19th century. If we could go back today to the beginning of European settlement and advise the Native Americans, would we tell them, you better get some guns right now and get these people out of here because they're going to be nothing but trouble? What is going to happen to your hospitality? The sorrows and anger of this story were given a powerful voice in Chatham in the late 20th century by one sort of Frank James. Frank James was a talented musician, the first Native American graduate of New England Conservatory. But racism kept him from a career in classical orchestras. He ended up as music director of the North schools for many years, and one of the people who worked under him was our own Frank Coco. It was Wamsutta James who started the tradition of a national day of mourning, he and others, at Thanksgiving. At the 350th anniversary of the Plymouth Rock landing, the committee thought it would be nice to hear from a Native American, and they asked James to speak. But when he showed them in advance the speech he planned to give, the committee withdrew the invitation. So Wamsutta James never got to deliver his critique, though his speech survives and it's available, where else? The internet. Here's a few excerpts. This is what Frank James would have said in the 350th anniversary celebration of the landing of Plymouth Rock in 1970. Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag, knew these facts, yet he and his people welcomed and befriended the settlers of the Plymouth plantation. Perhaps he did this because his tribe had been depleted by an epidemic, or his knowledge of the harsh oncoming winter was the reason for his peaceful acceptance of these acts. This action by Massasoit was perhaps our biggest mistake. We, the Wampanoag, welcomed you, the white man, with open arms, little knowing that it was the beginning of the end, that before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoag would no longer be a free people. What happened in these short 50 years? What has happened in the last 300 years? History gives us facts, and there were atrocities. There were broken promises, and most of these centered around land ownership. Among ourselves, we understood that there were boundaries, but never before had we had to deal with fences and stone walls. But the white man had a need to prove his worth by the amount of land that he owned. Only 10 years later, when the Puritans came, they treated the Wampanoag with even less kindness in converting the souls of the so-called savages. Although the Puritans were harsh to members of their own society, the Indian was pressed between stone slabs and hanged as quickly as any other witch. Unquote. James goes on to say that what happened to the Wampanoag remains something of a mystery. Quote, has the Wampanoag really disappeared? There is still an aura of mystery. We know that there was an epidemic that took many Indian lives. Some Wampanoags moved west and joined the Cherokee and Cheyenne. They were forced to move. Some even went north to Canada. Many Wampanoags put aside their Indian heritage and accepted the white man's way for their own survival. There are some Wampanoag who do not wish it known they're Indian for social or economic reasons. What happened to those Wampanoags who chose to remain and live among the early settlers? What kind of existence did they live as civilized people? True, living was not as complex as life today, but they dealt with the confusion and the change. Honesty, trust, concern, pride, and politics wove themselves in and out of the Wampanoag's daily living. Hence he was termed crafty, cunning, rapacious, and dirty. Wamsutta Frank James died in 2000 and is buried across the street here in Seaside Cemetery. But the James family still continues here. What do we do with this story? Do we cancel our celebrations of gratitude? Do we declare it to be a day of mourning instead of a day of thanksgiving? Do we refuse to accept gratitude as a spiritual practice? I think not. Gratitude, if it is to be genuine, must be not only for the good things in life, but for all that life has given us. If the boons we enjoy are based on the pains of others, we have to embrace that fact and do what we can to ease that pain today. Descendants of the original inhabitants have suffered racial prejudice over the years, and we need to recognize that. Part of the present healing is to recognize the wrongs that were done in the past. In 2012, the town of Chatham celebrated its 300th birthday, and the Chatham 300 Committee was interested in having a Wampanoag presence in the celebrations. This led to the formation of the Chatham Wampanoag Circle, with Jill James, who's with us today, the niece of Frank James, at its head. Several other folks have joined this effort, and I've offered this church as a meeting place for the circle, which they've accepted on several occasions. Last July, the circle did an exhibit on the Wampanoag for the Eldridge Library, which contained a symbolic recreation of the Wampanoag creation myth. My part in it was loading the James family pictures onto a digital picture frame, which was a great honor to see the progress in the 20th century of Native American family locally here. This is still a very small effort here in Charleston. But Chatham, did I say Charleston? Elsewhere on the Cape, the cultural renaissance is more robust. As most of you know, the federal government recognized not one but two Wampanoag tribes, the Mashpee tribe and the Gayhead or Aquina tribe on Martha's Vineyard. We tend to get absorbed in the various attempts to get casino gambling going by these groups, and overlook that there is also a serious effort underway to preserve and revive the Wampanoag language and culture. One dedicated linguist has reconstructed the language after all native speakers have died out, and has taught it to a core of others, and they are setting up actually an immersion school in Mashpee to teach it to a new generation. Sitting Bull is no more. Native Americans will not attempt armed uprisings against the Anglo culture and its government, which has settled in here over these 3 centuries. On the contrary, Native Americans have fought for the United States in its wars. Jill James's father, Howard, served proudly in the Army in World War II. And you may have seen the note in the news today, this week. Clarence Wolfguts, the last surviving of the Lakota code talkers, died this week. He used to encrypt messages that the Axis powers could not decipher in World War II. Most of those code talkers were Navajo. Some of them were Lakota Sioux as well. When Clarence Wolfguts heard about the attacks of 9/11, he asked his son to call up Washington to see if they still needed code talkers to help fight Al-Qaeda. He remained intensely proud of his service to the United States, even though he came back from a hero's sojourn to a life of poverty and alcoholism. The point I'm trying to make is that gratitude is not negated by tragedy or bad news. Susan Hall's fine essay on Thanksgiving says it's not about being glad for the good things that have happened to us. They are only moments in the sun. Thanksgiving is standing still with an injured and an open heart and letting the river run freely through us. It is an embrace of life in all its tragic and glorious proportions. I present this issue in the context of the story of the Pirlgirms and the Wampanoags, but it presents itself in many other contexts, great and small. Each of us has caused some harm to other people, and each of us has suffered harm caused by others in 1,000 ways, big and small. Nevertheless, we can choose to be grateful. We can choose to bless the world. We can bless each other. We can even bless our enemies, and we will be healthier people for it. I think this casts some light on what my prep school chaplain meant when he said, JFK's assassination, that is a good thing when a good man dies. It is a good thing to realize what a good man is. It is a good thing to realize what a bad man is. And it is a good thing to recognize genocide, racism, and other injustice that has occurred in the past, for that helps us to root it out in the present. Maybe the biggest thing we can be grateful for is that we will never achieve perfection in human relations. The doctrine of original sin has it all wrong. There was never a state of human perfection from which we have fallen. There have been barbarities all along in the past, and we have gradually evolved some insight on these, which might enable us to avoid inflicting such suffering.